Good afternoon, Secretary of State. I was interested that when you spoke in the Commons, and indeed when you published the White Paper, you said that Scotland was underserved. In what ways do you think that it is?
Well, I mean, that was, I think the reason I said that was because that was part of the opinion research which we conducted, which showed that there were several audiences that did not rate as highly as others in terms of satisfaction with the BBC services, and there was still a clear majority who were happy with the BBC in Scotland, but it wasn't quite as high as in one or two other parts.
So you're passing on public opinion rather than necessarily stating your own opinion?
Yes.
I see. There's a proposed board for Scotland. I wonder if you could tell us what relationship you think that it would have with the UK board overall.
I think that is very much a matter for the BBC. I mean, in terms of...
It goes to the heart of the unpopularity, though, doesn't it? Because the BBC Trust itself said that Scots were less trusting of the BBC in Scotland than any of the other constituent countries of the UK. So, in a way, the leadership that's shown by this new board will be absolutely crucial, as will its relationship with the board south of the border.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what you quote from the Trust is essentially the same finding that I was referring to. And that is obviously a matter of concern to the BBC, which they will need to address. I mean, I hope that the measures we're taking, which, for instance, will for the first time establish a separate service licence covering Scotland, which will make it clearer about what the BBC is doing to serve audiences in Scotland, and obviously the representation on the BBC board, will go some way to meeting that. But exactly how the BBC goes about it beyond that is a matter for them, and we can't prescribe a relationship between a Scottish board and the main board.
There's always been Scottish representation. The National Governor for Scotland, for example. I wonder, because obviously...
Well, there's a representation in the Trust.
Yes, but previously there was a governor for Scotland
indeed,
as well.
But as has been pointed out, the board is a stronger and different creature to what has gone before.
I wonder, in all the reading that you did about this, what it is that you think that causes this distrust of the BBC in Scotland?
And that is difficult for me, not being a Scot and also not therefore seeing the BBC's output in Scotland. So I mean, I wouldn't really feel qualified to judge. All I can do is see the evidence which is there, which is that people in Scotland clearly feel that the BBC is not sufficiently meeting their expectations for programming.
See, I would say, as a keen viewer and listener, I don't think people object to the radio in Scotland. I don't think they object to music in Scotland or drama. I think the particular problem that people have, and sadly it tends to flavour their appreciation of every other aspect of the BBC in Scotland, is news. And as you know, there's this proposal that's been piloted for a separate Scottish 6. There's speculation, gossip, rumour that the government is trying to influence this. So could I ask you, have you had any conversations, have any ministers had any conversations with the BBC about the separate Scottish 6?
Well, I mean, I've talked to the Director General about how he intends to go about addressing the feeling in Scotland, and that included touching on a question of a Scottish 6, on which I understand no decision has been taken, and it is a decision for the BBC. I mean, I do think that at the same time that I would hope that BBC will take action to address the feeling that you identify, nevertheless, the BBC is a UK national broadcaster, and it has a responsibility to bring the nation together, and news is a part of that.
That sounds like a political objective rather than an editorial judgment.
Well, I think the decision that, for instance, broadcasting is a Westminster responsibility is not devolved, and that the BBC is the UK national broadcaster is a political decision.
But it's not the BBC's job to pull the country together. That sounds a trifle jingoistic. It's a BBC's job, surely, to report news and not to act as some sort of general for UK unity. That sounds
I think
highly inappropriate.
I think the BBC's job is to report on events wherever they happen in the United Kingdom, which are of going to be of interest.
Well, we're agreed on that, of course.
I'll give you an example.
Of course, that's obvious.
I was privileged last week to be in Orkney for the Jutland commemoration. That was broadcast by the BBC across the nation. It happened to take place in Scotland, but it was not a Scottish event. It was a UK event. And that's the kind of thing which the BBC is extremely good at.
We're not disagreeing on that at all, of course. Obviously, important events should be covered. That is the definition of news. What the suggestion is that BBC News on the television should behave like BBC News on the radio, which should cover national, international, UK, European news on the basis of news merit. That is what this is about. And there is a suggestion within the BBC that the government is trying to influence and prevent this from happening. Is there any truth in that?
I don't think the BBC, anybody what you say makes total sense that news judgments are reached on that basis, and I don't think government won't want to influence that. I do think that...
At the moment, though, of course, that no news events south of the border are ever covered by Reporting Scotland. I mean, there could be Armageddon in Carlisle, and they would lead on something Couthie, possibly in Carluke. It's an artificial news programme because it will not cover things out with the border. That is what makes it so strange for any journalist to work on.
Well, I mean, as I say, I'm less familiar with... I mean, you're obviously directly familiar with the BBC's news output in Scotland. I'm less familiar with that, and actually that is clearly a matter for the BBC to decide.
But you haven't tried to influence?
No, I mean, it's a matter which I will talk to the BBC about, because I mean, I share your view that news is absolutely at the core of what the BBC does. And I do take the view that the BBC is a UK broadcaster. It is called the British Broadcasting Corporation.
We know that, but I'm just very keen to know, you have at no point hinted, suggested, or in any way implied to any senior figure in the BBC that you would rather not see this new programme launched.
Well, as far as I'm aware, no decision has been taken.
That's not what I asked.
Well, I think we might have concern if we felt that the central place of the BBC in providing a nationwide news bulletin was being changed, but that that is in large part an editorial matter for the BBC, and as far as I'm aware, it's not being proposed.
Sounds as if you have given a little push to the BBC and said we're a bit worried about this, especially given that you think the role of the BBC in news should be to bring the country together, as you said at the start of your answers.
Well, it is. I mean, it has come up in my discussions with the BBC because obviously we have talked about how the BBC intends to meet the concerns which you flagged up. Which I'm very keen that they should. But I wouldn't like to see the BBC become a federal organisation.
Charter renewals always tend to stimulate lots of speculation, and we've all collectively spent hundreds of hours talking about the BBC, and yet the white paper arrives, and it's fundamentally not that radical. I know there are things in it that are significant changes. But you know yourself a lot of the stuff that was flagged up in the papers. Now, you and I both know the way the newspapers work. Sometimes they absolutely invent things. Other times, governments and politicians drip-feed things in just to see what kind of reaction that they get. And then if they get a negative reaction, they say, how outrageous the newspaper published this. It's absolutely not what we intended. Are you disappointed that it hasn't been possible to be more radical?
Well, the first thing I would strongly say is that, in my view, the changes we are making are radical and substantial, and they are significant and will have a major effect on the way the BBC operates in the future. Obviously, the governance change, which we've talked about, but also, I mean, things like the opening up of the entire of the BBC schedule for competition. I mean, it's a major shift. Up until now, 50% has been reserved for in-house BBC production. In future, nothing will be reserved for in-house BBC production. And there are a number of other changes which I think do constitute opening up the BBC to full examination and audit by the National Audit Office is a significant change. Now, you're right that some of the more sort of lurid reports that appeared were not actually ever under consideration, and those who believed them will turn around and say, well, the white paper is a damp squib or is a retreat or whatever. But that I always made clear that the kinds of things that were being suggested weren't in prospect.
Charter renewals tend to focus quite often on structure. I mean, I've been through them myself, both now in politics and also when I was at the BBC. The Board of Governors became the Trust became a board again. Although, as you point out, a very different type of board. Looking both ahead and retrospectively, can you think of any significant decision that you would hope the new board would take that would have been very different looking back at the way some of the old boards behaved? How would this new board be different, citing perhaps a couple of specific examples looking back?
Well, I mean, the BBC governance, there were a number of failures in the course of the last 10 years, indeed during the duration of the last charter, and the new structure, we hope, would ensure those kinds of failures wouldn't happen again. I mean, I can give you, three which, in each case, I think resulted in a considerable loss of money to the licence fee payer, and to some extent post hoc, but clearly were bad decisions. One was the Digital Media Initiative, which the Public Accounts Committee spent some time looking at. The second was the severance payments that were made, which again the PAC was very critical of. And the third, which this committee was highly critical of in the past. I'm sorry Mr. Farrelly isn't with us because he was the principal crusader on this subject, was Lonely Planet.
And you think that this new board would have been able to head off each of these disasters at the pass?
I would hope so.
What about an example like, for example, which every person who ever worked at the BBC at the time found searing, which was the dismissal of Greg Dyke? Do you think that the BBC would have been able to defend itself in a situation like that under the new structure that you've proposed?
In the new structure, the Director General is answerable to the board and to the chairman of the board, and ultimately the chairman of the board is there with the members of the board to decide whether or not the Director General, what I was saying about a post-transmission role in scrutinising and holding to account Director General. We're getting back into the midst of time, but the particular episode that led to Greg Dyke's departure, which was obviously all around weapons of mass destruction and Radio 4 piece,
The Secretary of State, the particular circumstances which
that led to Greg Dyke's departure,
which were,
well, it was all, it was
Weapons of mass
Kelly
destruction.
and Kelly, the programme about
yes, no, I was just waiting for you to describe
weapons of mass destruction. I mean, the fact that broadcast proved hugely controversial, would be a perfect case of where the board and the chairman would expect, want to hear from the Director General probably within 24 hours as to what happened and why he felt that was a legitimate programme to broadcast.
But it's also a perfect example of how politicians can bully the BBC, because the staff didn't want Greg Dyke to go, Greg Dyke didn't want Greg Dyke to go, and it seemed that he was defending BBC values and journalistic independence against a very hostile and aggressive government.
Well, I think the chair and the board are there both to hold the Director General to account and to take action if they feel that he has failed to.
But nobody thought he
expectation. But
nobody
equally,
thought he'd failed.
the other side of that coin is that a strong chairman and board will defend the Director General if they believe the Director General has behaved properly.
Exactly. Now, this is why I think all of us on the committee are worried about BBC independence, and the chair asked you several questions, and Ms Elliott asked you several questions about this, because we all want board members to be appointed and to be free from government interference. Now, the chair mentioned specifically the issue of the National Portrait Gallery. Now, that sounds very obscure and arty-farty for people who don't know about it, but in a nutshell, the controversy was that the independent panel that was meant to be choosing trustees was dismissed by you because, in a blind sift, they didn't know that these people were your recommendations. The independent panel rejected all 5 of your preferred candidates, at which point you dismissed the panel, reconstructed the panel in the hope of getting a more satisfactory outcome. Now, you said in your answer that this was because of procedural failures. But I think all of us are very concerned that you might do that with the BBC appointees, citing procedural failures. So maybe you tell us what the procedural failures were and what promises you're prepared to give that you won't do the same thing with BBC top brass.
There are very clear procedures set down as to how a panel should operate, and it relates to the right of ministers to suggest candidates and the requirement that the panel is made aware of ministers' views. Now, those procedures were not properly followed.
Can you tell us what specifically the failure was?
It was the failure to make clear ministers' views. They didn't have to take them into account, but they should have been made aware of ministers' views when reaching their decision.
So the panel was dismissed because members of the panel were not told that these 5 candidates were your preferred choices?
Yes.
Well, I have to say I find that immensely worrying. In a blind sift, I don't want to know who your choices are. I want to look at the CVs of 5 candidates, I want to interview them, and I want to make my own decision. I don't want to see a note saying the Secretary of State likes this one, but not this one. And
well,
for you to sack the panel on that basis, I think is immensely worrying for all of us who are concerned that you might do the same thing at the BBC.
Well, if the procedure is followed properly, then obviously there would be no need. In this particular case, the procedure was not followed properly.
But why should they have known who your preferred choices were, unless it was your intention to influence this independent panel?
It is the case under the public appointments procedure. These are government appointees at the end of the day, but nevertheless there is an independent panel that assesses candidates, but it is part of that procedure that the views of government are known to panel members so that they can take account of them. They don't have to take account of them, but they should at least know.
So they feel pressurised.
Well, it's not a question of. I mean,
it certainly is. If you sack the panel because they haven't been told who your preferred choices are, your clear objective is to put them under pressure to take one of your preferred choices.
It is a requirement that they are aware of ministerial views. They do not have to take account of them, and had the panel decided to reject all of those candidates who the government had indicated they believed were strong candidates, they would have been perfectly entitled to do so.
So in the BBC, this new board, when it's chosen, everybody will know in the panel who your preferred candidates are, and they'll know that unless they accept one of your preferred candidates and are told quite clearly that it's your preferred candidate, there's a chance that the appointment board could be dismissed and back to square one again.
There is no chance of the appointments of the panel being dismissed unless they don't follow. And I would point out particularly to you, Mr. Nicolson, that of course the appointments panel will be made aware of the view in terms of the appointment of the NED representing Scotland, of the view of the Westminster government and the Holyrood government, because the Holyrood government will be involved in the selection process.